Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Constitution Series, Equality and Justice for All. I'm Chevy Humphrey, the Hazel President and CEO at Arizona Science Center, and a very proud member of the O'Connor Institute Board of Directors. And on behalf of Justice O'Connor and the Institute, we are delighted to have you with us. I am extremely humbled to be moderating this panel and to gain more knowledge about families that were enslaved at Monticello. But to hear from a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson and a curator that tells us this story is absolutely amazing. Slavery impacted and still impacts so many of us. But learning and understanding the past gives one the ability to change the future. Today's program reminded me of a quote that my father would recite to me every morning before being bussed out of our neighborhood to better schools in another. He would say to me, Frederick Douglass said, knowledge makes you unfit to be a slave. Today, we are honored to have with us Gail Jessup and Dr. Emily Johnson for Paradox of Liberty, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello. Gail Jessup White became Monticello's first public relations and community engagement officer in 2016. She is not only a direct Jefferson descendant, but also related to two well-documented families enslaved at Monticello, the Hemings and the Hubbards. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation hired Jessup White to help improve the way in which the story of slavery at the plantation is told. She has spent 4 decades of her life exploring her connection to Thomas Jefferson and her family's heritage. A former award-winning TV reporter and anchor, she holds a BA from Howard University School of Communications and a Master's of Science in Journalism from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Dr. Emily Johnson is an associate curator at Monticello. Her scholarship focuses on late 18th and early 19th century American cultural landscapes, architecture, and material culture, with particular interest in the lived experiences of women and enslaved people in plantation contexts. She holds an MA in art history from the Williams College Graduate Program in History of Art and a PhD in art and architectural history from the University of Virginia. Emily manages Paradox of Liberty, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, a traveling exhibition that features members of Monticello's enslaved community and their descendants and the day-to-day operations of the curatorial department. Now, please join me in welcoming Gail Jessup White and Dr. Emily Johnson.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Chevy, and thank you, Sarah Suggs, Matthew Feeney, and the board. It's really thrilling to be here with you today. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. It's about 70 miles from Charlottesville, the home of Monticello and the University of Virginia. And it's really the focal point of a lot of attention and has been for a number of years. Now, as Chevy mentioned, I'm Monticello's first public relations and community engagement officer. I'm also the first descendant of the enslaved and the enslaver to work at Monticello and to be paid for it. So that says something. Now, before we dive into the exhibition, and it's a fantastic exhibition, I'd like to share with you a little bit about how I ended up working at a place whose history includes enslaving my family. Now, it's really a long story. It took me many, many years to collect this story. And I'd love for all of you to read about it in my book, scheduled for release in the fall of 2021 by HarperCollins. Today, we'll have to settle for the abridged version. Now, many thanks in advance to Jonathan Gelbert, the Institute's Director of Educational Initiatives and Innovation, for assistance with the slideshow you're about to see. So, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and you see me here with my older brother, Bruce, and the Washington Monument. We grew up comfortably middle class, and I had a love for history, especially presidential history. My favorite was Thomas Jefferson. So you can imagine how curious I was when I overheard a conversation between my dad and older sister Janice, claiming that we are Jefferson descendants. So here we are. I was 13 years old at the time. My sister was 32, almost 20 years older than I. My sister is a very glamorous one at the front of the picture, and that's mom behind her. Janice was just back from 2 years in Asia, where her husband was covering the Vietnam War for Time magazine. She and her husband were the guests of honor at Saigon's American Embassy when the conversation took what was for Janice an unpleasant turn: family lineage. Everyone at the dinner table was white, aside from my sister and her husband, and everyone at the dinner table was claiming to have a heritage that sounded tantamount to royalty. Now, my sister is a small R Republican and a small D Democrat, and she was deeply offended. Americans had shed blood to free themselves from monarchy. So she decided to teach everyone a history lesson and outdo them. Rising to her greatest height, my very elegant sister took a breath and announced, "I'm a descendant from Thomas Jefferson." While she said, the room went dead silent, aside from the sound of silver touching china. Now that was 1968, 30 years before the Foster DNA study pointed to Jefferson as the father of Sally Hemings' children. I do hope that you can still see me. Good. I think we're good. And I'll resume. The DNA study in 1968 pointed to Jefferson as the father of Sally Hemings' children. They had 6 children together, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. And until rather recently, such conversations were quite taboo. We talk about these things at Monticello. But in 1968, these were not conversations people were typically having. But it was not taboo for my sister. Now, I can imagine that the guests were as shocked as I clearly was when I heard this story when I was 13. And this is my family you see before you. But when I asked Dad about her genealogy, he was noncommittal. That's what they say was his only comment. But in time, I found out that the story was part of our family's oral history, that it was passed down from his mother's half sister, Aunt Peachy. Now, Aunt Peachy was an illiterate woman. She was a domestic. She couldn't read, she couldn't write, she couldn't even spell her own name. And I never knew her. She died around the same time I was born. But Aunt Peachy was convinced that her nieces and nephews were descended from Thomas Jefferson. And this is the story she told my older sister, Jan. And that's the story that Jan eventually shared with me. So while I was skeptical in the beginning, I also felt that there was something to the family lore, that it did have some credibility. You see, my dad, and here we are graduating, I was graduating in 1968 from Howard University. My dad was Black. However, to some, he looked white. He was also 6'2", freckle-faced, and as a young man, had red hair. That should sound very familiar to a lot of you. He also had a sharp nose with a gently sloped bridge. I would eventually learn that his was a Jeffersonian nose. I've said to my cousins, Black and white, some of us were spared that Jeffersonian nose, which is quite handsome on men, not quite so lovely on women. So my dad and I were close. We were very close. We talked about everything: politics, religion, football, but we never talked about our family's ties to Jefferson or anything about his family for that matter, especially about his mother. His mother, Eva, was her name. And here's Eva, my grandmother. She died, you see, when Daddy was 5 years old. He couldn't remember her face. He told me, or the sound of her voice. It makes me sad to think of it even now, decades later, after hearing this story from him. You see, Dad wasn't even sure of his mother's maiden name. It could have been Robinson, he said, or it could have been Taylor. She died at 36 years old from one of history's deadliest plagues, tuberculosis. It gets even sadder, I think, because of the 7 children that she had with her husband, Arthur Jessup, my grandfather. And there you see him in his Navy uniform. He actually served in the Spanish-American War. He was a gunner's mate in the Spanish-American War, served in the Philippines. But of their 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys, only the boys survived. Now here's a picture of the 2 oldest girls, Louise and Thelma. That's right, Louise and Thelma. And poor Louise and Thelma died in their late teens, both of them. There were 3 other girls, Artie, Carrie, and Helena. We don't have pictures of Helena, but we do have these pictures of Artie and Carrie. Carrie died soon after her 16th birthday. In fact, Dad told me that he went to see her in the hospital and she said to him, "Sweet 16 and never been kissed." And she was dead soon after that. So his childhood was very, very painful and very tragic. All the family, all the girls, all the mother and the 5 girls died from tuberculosis. So Dad struggled, but he loved me and he shared those stories with me. And all of that led me to this search, to wanting to know more, about my dad's family and about our connections to Jefferson. And even though he knew so little about his mother, he was very confident about one thing, and that's where she was born, Charlottesville. So I remember saying to Daddy when he told me this, and my dad was a very wise man, I should tell you, very smart man. Like guy, he attended Howard University. I said to Daddy when he told me, "Dad, you know Jefferson was from Charlottesville." And Dad, in all of his wisdom, said very calmly, "I know." So he kind of set me on this path. Now, Dad had an older brother, Uncle Eugene, and Uncle Eugene had more vivid memories of his mother in childhood. When I went to see Uncle Eugene, and here my dad and Uncle Eugene are in the 1980s when I went to visit him, it was shortly before he died. I had lots and lots of questions. And he said, sure, he'd heard the Jefferson story, but he didn't know any more than Dad. But he did know more about his mother. And here's what he told me, that she was 6 feet tall, 6 feet tall. And that she sang and played the piano, that they had a piano in their parlor, is what they would have called like a living room space at that time. And that she was a very happy person. And that his father, my grandfather, used to call her his angel. So he had these lovely memories about his mother. And then he revealed to me a true family treasure. And here we see it. I call it the Robinson Taylor Bible now. And he said this Bible was hers, that it had been passed down from generation to generation. And this Bible was engraved with the initials DT, and the date, 1821. Now, my Uncle Eugene, and I adored my uncle, promised to bequeath this Bible to me, to give it to me upon his passing. And now, of course, it's one of my prized possessions. I keep it. I love it so much, and I keep it in the safety deposit box because I don't want anything to happen to it. And what's notable about the Bible were the initials on it, the initials DT. Now, T, we now know, was likely for Taylor. And Taylor, and it gets a little entangled here, but Taylor, I'll repeat, was one of the names Dad associated with his mother. Taylor was one, Robinson was the other. Thus, this Bible with the initials DT became a clue to uncovering my family's connection to Jefferson. And Uncle Eugene also told me about gave me another picture and told me another story. And it's about this woman. She's my grandmother's sister. We believe her name was Lucy, but that's just a guess because Aunt Lucy married wealth and passed into white society. And look at her. She looks white. She looks wealthy. She looks elegant. And she walked away from her family and moved to New York and lived in a white world. Not an uncommon practice then, and something some people still do today. Now, she was there with my grandmother when she died, Uncle Eugene said, and she vowed never to return unless she could take the three surviving children with her. At that time, Carrie, the one who died right before her 16th birthday, Uncle Eugene and Daddy were alive. And Aunt Lucy wanted to take them, educate them, and keep them with her. But my grandfather, I should say, said no. He pushed back. He demurred. He wanted to keep his children with him. He was heartbroken. His children were all he had. So she left. She kept her word, and she never came back. Carrie, as we know, died. The two boys survived into adulthood. They lived a long life. My dad died at 90. Uncle Eugene was in his 80s. As for Aunt Lucy, the family heard from her one last time. It was toward the end of her life when my parents got a call from someone in New York looking for relatives of an ailing woman. She said people were taking advantage of her and that they were claiming her wealth, that they were stealing her wealth. So my dad asked the person on the other end of the line, and remember this is in the early 60s, if that person were white or Negro, which was the terminology of the era. So the person on the other end of the line said, well, this woman's white. So my dad said, well, then she can't be related to us, and hung up the phone. So, I mean, it's a sad story on the one hand. On the other hand, there went my inheritance, just like that. So through the years, my sisters and I have two sisters, assumed we were descended from Jefferson's liaison with Sally Hemings. But decades later, we learned the truth that we are Jefferson descendants, not through Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, but through one of his great-great-grandsons, a man named Moncure Robinson Taylor. There's that Taylor name. Evidence indicates that Moncure Robinson Taylor took up with my great-grandmother. Her name was Rachel Robinson. So there you have it, the names that my dad associated with his mother, Robinson and Taylor. It would also explain why Daddy wasn't sure of his mother's name, because she used, I would discover, both names on sacred documents such as confirmation, we're Catholic, such as confirmation certificates, she would use Taylor. On official documents, such as a marriage license, she used Robinson. So in Dad's mind, and as he grew up, she had two names. And in fact, it's apparent that she felt she had two names. She made claim to her Jefferson ancestry by using that name Taylor. And to put it very simply, Jefferson's great-great-grandson was my great-grandfather. Now, this is really entangled, which is why we have this family tree. And I'm going to go over this family tree with you. If we could go to the family tree, that would be great. There we have it. So at the bottom of the tree, we see Thomas Jefferson and his wife, Martha Wales. They had several children, only two of whom survived into adulthood. One of them was Martha Jefferson. Martha Jefferson was my 4 times great-grandmother. She marries Thomas Mann Randolph, who incidentally is a direct descendant of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. So that means that I am also a direct descendant of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. American history is very complicated. Thomas Mann Randolph and Martha Jefferson have a son, have lots of children. And they have a son, their oldest son, Thomas Jefferson Randolph. He marries Jane Hollins Nicholas. And they have many children, one of whom they name after Thomas Jefferson Randolph's mother, Martha. So we have a Martha Randolph who marries John Charles Randolph Taylor. They have many children, among them a man, one of the youngest children, Moncure Robinson Taylor, who does not marry, but who has a relationship with Rachel Robinson. Rachel Robinson was actually enslaved by the Taylor and Randolph families. And then, of course, Rachel Robinson has several children, as my dad told me. Eva, my grandmother, Lucy, the one Aunt Lucy who passed for white, and two boys whose names we don't know. But my dad always said his mother had, his mother had two brothers, I should say, and they passed into white society, and we don't know what happened to them. Eva Robinson marries Arthur Jessup. They have several children. We know what happened to them. 5 girls died. The 2 boys survived. One of those boys becomes my father, marries Teresa Jessup, and they had 5 children, and I'm the youngest of their 5. So I hope that helps a little bit with that rather complicated history. And in the next slide, we have the Hemmings family tree. Now, I said earlier that my sister and I always believed that we were descended from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, but as I've explained, that was not the case. We're descended from a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I would like to add here, too, that these relationships were complicated. Thomas Jefferson was not the only person, as we can see from my own family, to take up with an enslaved person, Sally Hemings. His great-great-grandson took up with a woman who was enslaved by his family. And we also know, and you can see in this slide, that Elizabeth Hemings, the mother of Sally Hemings, took up with her owner, John Wales. And Thomas Jefferson's son-in-law took up with a Hemings after Thomas Jefferson's daughter died. So these connections across racial lines were multi-generational. It was not new with Thomas Jefferson. It's not unique to Monticello. It happened throughout enslavement in America. So in the next slide, explains a little bit more about my family. I learned that my great-grandmother, Rachel, who took up with this Moncure Robinson Taylor, was in fact a Hemings. You see, her grandfather was Sally Hemings' brother. His name was Peter Hemings. Peter Hemings was a brewer and a cook at Monticello, described by Jefferson as diligent and highly intelligent. Rachel's mother was named Sally after her aunt. So think about that for a moment. That means that there were actually 2 Sally Hemingses. One was my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Sally Hemings, and she married a man named Robinson. And the other was the famous one. She was my 4 times great aunt. So this tree, again, makes it a little easier to follow. Oh, if we could go back to that tree, I'm sorry. Thank you. Captain Hemmings was the person who brought Elizabeth Hemings, Sally Hemings' mother, to America. Parthenia is believed to be the name of Elizabeth Hemings' mother. She was a full-blooded African woman. They have Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings takes up with John Wales. They have several children, including Sally Hemings, you can see her here, and Peter Hemings. Peter Hemings marries a woman named Betsy. They have many children, including a child named Sally Hemings, who becomes my great-great-grandmother. She marries Edmund Robinson. They have Rachel Robinson, and so forth and so on. So those are the complicated connections that make up, in part, the families of Monticello and the descendant community at Monticello. And I can thank the brilliant scholars there and the groundbreaking initiative, the Getting Word Oral History Project, for helping me uncover my family's roots. And I'm especially grateful to Cinder Stanton, who's the founder of Getting Word. Cinder not only helped me trace my family, a family it took me decades to find, but she mentored me in the process. And I can say that she's one of the best persons I know and a very, very dear friend. She's the patron saint among Monticello's descendant community. Because of Getting Word, DNA testing, and honestly, my own dogged 40-year search, I was able to trace my heritage. I was able to find lost family and to meet new relatives. And here you see many, many of us, because in 2018, Getting Word celebrated its 25th anniversary by bringing together hundreds of descendants for the largest family reunion of its kind in modern history. It's also when we opened our new exhibitions. One of them was the kitchen, where my great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Hemmings, cooked, and also the new exhibition, The Life of Sally Hemings. So it was a marvelously inspiring weekend, that June 16th in 2018. And there were 25 Robinsons there, 25 Robinsons, many of us meeting for the first time, some of us living as whites who came back to Monticello to connect with that history. That's how much it means to us. The dad my family lost when his mother died, we all connected, we came together. And it was as if we'd known each other our entire lives. It was beautiful. So the work continues at Monticello. The researchers do their work, the archaeologists continue their digging, and the descendants continue to find out more about Monticello's enslaved community. We have a fantastic video. You'll hear a voice and you'll recognize the voice, which explains some of the work, explains Getting Word, and explains how all of Monticello's staff and the descendants work together to give voices to people who for too long were voiceless.
My name is Fountain Hughes. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson.
My grandmother was a house servant.
My ancestors were at Monticello as slaves.
Of the hundreds of people held in slavery at Monticello, we have images of only these 7 men and women. All of their names are preserved in Thomas Jefferson's plantation record books, but the human dimension is missing from these meticulous accounts.
Can't you see them devils have come to take you far from me?
In 1993, historians at Monticello started a project to fill in that missing dimension. We began to seek out the descendants of enslaved families and to listen to the stories they told about their ancestors. To date, we've interviewed over 200 people. They tell an American story of struggle to make real Jefferson's words about liberty and equality. After Jefferson died in 1826, the Monticello families were sold at auction and scattered in many directions. Set free with the help of her family, Anne Elizabeth Isaacs and her husband fought against slavery from their Ohio farmhouse, a station on the Underground Railroad. Their sons-in-law and a cousin served as officers in the 55th Massachusetts Regiment during the Civil War. After gaining their freedom, both Peter Fawcett and Robert Hughes founded Baptist churches in Ohio and Virginia that still thrive today.
Leave this house and all I know.
In California, Pauline Powell Burns was a celebrated artist and musician. And in Boston, William Monroe Trotter was a powerful voice for equal rights and a founder of the Niagara Movement, the precursor of the NAACP. It's been over 25 years since the Getting Word Project began, and participants have started taking the lead on seeking out their family history. Some descendants are even reconnecting with branches of their family separated long ago because of slavery. New people who are still discovering their ancestral roots at Monticello are being welcomed with open arms.
You don't know who you are until you know where you came from.
I felt more pride at my ancestors. I felt stronger. I felt that what they did just shows their strength of character. It gave them some humanity that I have still been missing.
Descendants are passing their experiences and their oral history down to the next generation. Since 1993, the descendants have often gathered at Monticello to honor their ancestors, whose lives and work were essential to Jefferson, his house, and his plantation. Today, these families remember the role that they've played in fulfilling Jefferson's and America's promise of freedom and equality.
Wow, that was so powerful. I remember those words from my mother before she'd have me read the Negro Encyclopedia. You don't know who you are until you know where you came from. Just powerful words. And now we'd like to continue the program, and please welcome Dr. Emily Johnson.
Thank you so much, Chevy, and the O'Connor Institute for inviting us to speak with you all today. And Gail, thank you for giving me the perfect segue to introduce The Paradox of Liberty, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello. The exhibition's fundamental question is the paradox of this nation's founding. How did a nation founded on ideals of liberty and justice coexist with the dehumanizing institution of slavery? Using Monticello as a lens through which to investigate this paradox, the exhibition focuses on the enslaved men, women, and children owned by Thomas Jefferson. Through images, family trees, and more than 300 artifacts and objects, visitors learn about 6 multi-generational families, exploring their relationships, their accomplishments, and their tragedies. The exhibition began in partnership with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and was first shown in Washington, D.C. in 2012. Since then, it has traveled to 5 other cities and is now on view in Richmond, Virginia. We estimate that more than 1.3 million people have visited the exhibition, which is underwritten by the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are grateful to the NEH for their generous support. So let's talk for a second about the paradox. How did the person who wrote what historian John Meacham calls the mission statement of America, the self-evident truths that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how did that man own people? How did he continue to do so for his whole life, even though, time and again, he called slavery a moral abomination? And because a good paradox can take examination from more than one angle, let's flip the perspective a bit. 607 people were owned by Thomas Jefferson. They lived in close proximity to him for generations, decades. What do they think of the fact that their owner, the person who held their fates in his hands, wrote that all men are created equal? Jefferson rationalized his ownership of people through a sense of paternalistic racism, writing that freeing enslaved people was like, quote, abandoning children, end quote. But by bringing people's lives and stories out of the shadows imposed by slavery, visitors see a more inclusive history of America that refutes the widespread and racist view that Black people were inferior to white people. For more information about the people at Monticello than what I'll be able to share with you today in our short time together, we'll be offering some links for you to learn more about enslaved people, including Sally Hemings, and to learn more about the Getting Word Oral History Project. So let's turn to the exhibition. The exhibition has 3 sections. In the current installation, the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia in Richmond, visitors to the exhibition meet the enslaved families first. The next section introduces Monticello, the plantation, and provides some context about the scope and scale of slavery in Virginia during Jefferson's lifetime. The third section, drawing heavily from the Getting Word Oral History Project, introduces descendants and their continued fight for freedom and equality. The largest family who lived at Monticello were the Hemmings family. With about 80 members and spanning 5 generations, more generations of the Hemmings family lived at Monticello than the Jefferson family. The exhibition features Sally Hemings, John Hemmings, who was her half-brother, a carpenter and joiner, and Elizabeth Hemings, their mother, the matriarch of the family, among others. Many families in the Monticello community are connected. The Fawcett family are related to the Hemingses through Joseph Fawcett, a blacksmith who was Elizabeth Hemings's grandson. He married Edith Hearn, a member of the Hearn family, who are also featured in the exhibition. The installation on the Fawcetts describes their tireless efforts to strengthen family bonds and to gain freedom. In 1806, Joseph Fawcett ran away from Monticello to see his wife, who was working in the president's house in Washington, D.C. Fawcett was freed by Jefferson's will, but the rest of his family were not. He worked for decades to reunite his family after the 2 sales of people from Monticello. Fawcett children continued to strive for freedom. Anne Elizabeth Fawcett Isaacs operated a safe house on the Underground Railroad in Ohio. Peter Fawcett could read and write and wrote free passes for people trying to escape slavery, including his sister, Isabella. Despite his father's attempts to buy him and at least 2 efforts to run away, Peter Fawcett remained enslaved until 1850. Later descendants of the Fawcett family feature significantly in the last section of the exhibition. William Monroe Trotter, Joseph Fawcett's great-grandson, published the Boston Guardian, a newspaper where he fought lynching, discrimination, and segregation in the early 20th century. Their great-great-granddaughter, Peggy Damon Priestley, is a civil rights activist who participated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, in the early 1960s. The exhibition includes the Granger family. The patriarch of the Granger family, George Granger Sr., acted as an overseer at Monticello in the late 1790s and was paid for his work, although he remained enslaved. In the 1840s, George Granger's son, Isaac, recorded his memories of life at Monticello. In his recollections, he called Jefferson out for hypocrisy in writing that all men are created equal, but reclaiming people after the Revolutionary War. Granger remembered, quote, "Old Master was mightily pleased to see his people come back safe and sound, although all men by nature are free and equal, and to hear of the plate," end quote. Plate was the silver. Knowing the O'Connor Institute's emphasis on civil discourse, I'll never miss an opportunity to quote Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers once said, quote, "I think the greatest thing about things is they remind of people," end quote. That's what the objects in the exhibition do. They remind us of people. The buckles, marbles, mouth harps, coins, buttons, fragments of plates, teacups, and platters. These objects are relics of real people and documents of real life. Objects speak in powerful ways that help modern viewers connect directly to people in the past. One of the great privileges of working on this exhibition is that it has continued to evolve. The most recent tour, beginning in 2018, has taken the exhibition to African American museums. Conversations with colleagues at the hosting institutions continually inspire me to refine my understanding of the exhibition. Here are just a few examples. Every venue requires a slightly different organization of the exhibition. Different places require different places, different spaces. Having said that, we have become more sensitive to the way we install the exhibition to make sure the presentation centers the lives and experiences of enslaved individuals. We want visitors to meet enslaved families first, instead of encountering Thomas Jefferson upon entering the exhibition. We altered the title slightly. The title used to be Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, The Paradox of Liberty. But we heard from colleagues at our hosting institutions who felt the title foregrounded Jefferson when the exhibition really is not about him. So in a small shift, we put the paradox, the theme of the exhibition, first. The installation on Sally Hemings is new and mirrors the Life of Sally Hemings exhibition installed at Monticello in 2018. For the traveling show, we built a freestanding structure to represent the slave dwelling at Monticello, where she and her children are recorded to have lived. Within the structure, viewers can watch a film based on the recollections of her son Madison Hemings that explores her life and legacy. One of the most powerful installations in the exhibition is a wall with the names of the 607 people owned by Jefferson. As originally designed, this piece was placed behind a life-size statue of Jefferson, surrounded by a circular structure. In previous installations, this was the first thing a visitor encountered. Over the last 3 installations, again based on feedback from our colleagues, we realized that the monumental figure of Jefferson was overshadowing the names and the point about the paradox the installation was intended to make. So we began relocating the installation within the exhibition, placing it towards the back instead of having it front and center. We also experimented with the positioning of the statue. In Detroit, at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, we put the statue so that it did not confront viewers face on, but instead was looking at one of the families Jefferson enslaved, the Hubbard family, members of whom ran away from Jefferson's plantations in resistance to their bondage. And finally, at the Black History Museum in Richmond, we reconfigured the whole installation. There are powerful conversations and reconsiderations of monuments happening right now, particularly in Richmond. In Richmond, we positioned Jefferson inextricably connected to the people he owned to communicate the point of the exhibition. I hope this has given you a brief overview of the Paradox of Liberty, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, and I believe at this point we are going to move to more of a conversation.
Thank you so much. This was an incredible presentation, and I just want to hear more. I wish we could extend it another 2 hours. This is amazing. But there are a few questions I'd like to ask, and from our audience. What are the main takeaways you want visitors to have from the exhibit? And what is the solution to the paradox of liberty?
Emily, you want to give it a try?
Sure, I'll be happy to take a start. I think the main thing that we want people to take away from the exhibition is an appreciation for the lives that people lived, for the relationships that they forged, for the extent to which people practiced humanity in the midst of an, as I said earlier, a dehumanizing institution. That, for me, that's what I want people to come away with.
So Emily mentioned enslaved people who ran away. I am not only descended from the Hemmings family, but from another family, the Hubbard family. The Hubbards were enslaved principally at Poplar Forest, which was Jefferson's retreat about 30, 40 miles from Charlottesville. 2 of the Hubbard brothers were nail boys at Monticello, spending their entire day from sunrise to sunset banging out nail rod for one of Jefferson's industries. And both brothers ran away. One, Philip, ran away to be with his wife at Poplar Forest. The other, Jamie, ran away because he didn't want to be enslaved. He wanted freedom. He understood what freedom meant. He ran away not once, but twice. He was captured both times, brought back in chains to Monticello. Jefferson had him whipped to shame him and as a lesson to the others, and sold south, never to be heard from again. So I bring that up because what I'd like people to walk away from when they see this exhibition is the strength of the people enslaved. Emily mentioned the humanity of them, the emotions that they experienced. Walk away knowing that these were strong people who resisted the institution. They were resilient people who were bounded in spite of the institution, and they recovered. This was the most oppressive institution created by man, and they remained strong and recovered. So resistance, resilience, recovery. That's what I'd like people to walk away from when they leave that exhibition.
Thank you. And this leads into the second question. How should Americans view slavery today in the context of the history?
Well, that's tough, isn't it, Emily? Because
Yeah.
there's only one way to view slavery. It's abhorrent. It's horrible. It's disgusting. And it's unbelievable that in a country built on ideals of freedom and democracy and liberty, that there should have been, in some states, half the population enslaved. And it should also be remembered that the enslaved people built much of the American economy, period. America was built on the backs of free labor. We became an economic engine on the backs of Africans and African Americans. So I can't tell people how to feel about it. I can share the knowledge I have, and I can tell you how I feel about it, or can't, because I get my blood starts to boil. So let's just ask Emily to take it on.
Well, like you said, Gail, I can't tell people how to feel about slavery. I can say categorically that slavery was a blot, to paraphrase Jefferson, was a blot on this nation, is a blot on this nation, and has left lingering traumas and lingering legacies that are still being felt by people of color today. And for that, looking at history, they say that history is around so that you can learn from it. And I think that we're all better if we can look at our history and look at our complete history, look at the history of everyone who has been a part of this country, white people, Black people, Native Americans, all kinds of people of color, and try to learn from each other and to try to talk to each other.
I agree with you, Emily. I think that's right. And to extend your quote, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. Thank you, Mr. Faulkner. And we do still live with the consequences of enslavement, and we see it in headlines daily. And I firmly believe, and I'm committed to this, and I know Monticello is committed to this as well, that we must work toward being one people. We are all Americans. We all have something to give. All of our ancestors have contributed something to make this country what it is today, for better or worse. And there are far more better things about America than there are worse things about America. So we must strive to live up to the aspirations of the founders. All men and women were created equal. And we have to continue to work toward that as an aspiration. It has to be more than that. It has to become a reality. And when I see young people protesting, and as you said, Emily, Black, white, brown, red, yellow, Americans, I actually have faith and hope that we will move forward as a nation. And I'm not talking about violent protesting. I'm talking about the protests where people are working together, socially distanced, masked, and standing up for American convictions of freedom and justice for all.
Wow, that was pretty powerful. And I think you answered the next question, but I'm going to read it anyway because our guest wanted more depth to it. What can we learn or do to form a more perfect union?
Well, I think you're right. We kind of answered it, but in order to, I think we can learn our history. We can understand our history. When Monticello's open now, we can travel easily again, I would highly recommend that people visit Monticello and similar sites, visit Washington, D.C., visit the other museums that give a vision or allow us to absorb and learn about what happened in our history. I mean, these are real tangible representations of what American lives were like. I would recommend that people push themselves to the Constitution, read the Declaration of Independence. And when you look at someone else, think of your mother, your father, your sister, your cousins, your brother. Doesn't matter what that color is. Think of what it would be like to walk in that person's shoes. I think if we do that, that we will be better people for it and better citizens for it, and care for each other. During this time of pandemic and economic strife, we really must think of each other. We must know that history and know how we got here and understand, as I said earlier, that we are one people. We're all Americans. We're all in this together, folks. We really are. And if we're going to get through it, we must think that way. What do you think, Emily?
Well, echoing you, I'm always struck by, and I think this is another statement from John Meacham, that Monticello really embodies the best and the worst of American history. It's all right here. And there are a lot of places like Monticello where you can go and you can see the ideals of this country and you can see its shortcomings. And you can see that playing out in a historical context, and you can see it playing out in real time through people's conversations, through watching people interact with a history that maybe they haven't heard much about before, and ask questions and start to realize. And one of the things at Monticello, we've been working on these materials for a long time. We've been studying the enslaved communities for decades, and it's really, I think, for us here on site, when we have a visitor who comes to Monticello and says, oh, I haven't thought about this that way before. That's the moment that really energizes us, that really helps us know that we're being part of the civil discourse around this country's history and where this country can go moving forward.
I think that's absolutely right. And Monticello is the epicenter for such conversations. I'm glad that you mentioned John Meacham, because he has written so eloquently about Jefferson and also about America and where we are now and how we got here. His latest book, The Soul of America, one of his latest books, he's written so prolifically, I can't keep up with him, does speak, in fact, to some of the consequences of not knowing our history and also the power of being informed. And I said earlier that when it's safe to travel again, please visit Monticello, and by all means, please do. But meanwhile, we do have virtual tours, and we have live Facebook sessions every day that I think people would really enjoy and learn so much. And again, help us move toward understanding that history, how we got here, and understanding how we can move forward as a country.
Thank you. We have one last question, and it's from one of our viewers that graduated from UVA in 1986 and remembers hearing about the TJ Sally Hemings story as a love story. How can that be when she was enslaved? She didn't have freedom of choice. She was his slave.
Well, Emily, you're the scholar, and I will speak to this emotionally, so I'm going to let you start that from a scholarly perspective.
Sure. It's your questions, Chevy, are exactly right. How is and I don't like to use the word relationship when I'm talking about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, because I feel like we have too much of a 21st century view of a relationship as a consensual kind of interaction. But Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, whatever it was, they were involved for decades. And I think Annette Gordon-Reed, who's the foremost scholar on the Hemmings family and the foremost scholar on Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, she really positions it that in a relationship that is, or an interaction or engagements that are decades long, the emotional side of it will change and changes all the time. And that's true for everyone. You can think of our own relationships when you have long-term relationships with people, and I'm using that word, and I realize that your emotional frequency changes over time. We don't know. Sally Hemings was not able to give consent because she was property. The only thing we really know about Sally Hemings and how she felt about Thomas Jefferson is in the recollections of her son, Madison Hemings, which is the source that we used for the Life of Sally Hemings installation. And Madison Hemings tells us that his mother trusted Thomas Jefferson, that they came to an agreement in Paris when she was very, very young, that upon reaching the age of 21, her children would be freed. And that's the agreement under which she agreed to return to Virginia and return to enslavement. So Madison Hemings doesn't tell us that his mother loved his father, but he does tell us that she trusted him, that she trusted that he would keep his word and free her children.
And he did. He freed their children.
Yes.
And I think it's important to note that Sally Hemings was, we believe, 16 years old when she negotiated this arrangement with Thomas Jefferson, that she was thousands of miles away from her home, her family, her mother. And the reason this is so important to note is that Sally Hemings, for that brief time in her life, exercised her own agency. It's important for people to recognize that she was an intelligent, smart woman working as best she could to determine her future and the future of her children, which says a lot about her. And among the descendants, we ask people to not marginalize Sally Hemings by dismissing her as a captive of Jefferson's, but to look at her as a complete person and what she was able to accomplish as a human, as a living, breathing woman. That's important. I would also like to add that while Sally Hemings wasn't manumitted, she was given her time, which means that upon Jefferson's death, she lived as a freed woman in Charlottesville. Had she been manumitted, she would have been forced to leave the Commonwealth of the state, as was the law at that time for emancipated people. So you're right, Emily. It's important to note that Madison felt his mother trusted Jefferson, and she had the right to, because he kept his word. These are complicated stories. These are real people. They were complex people. It's not black and white. There was a lot going on there. So, gosh, it was so nice. It's always nice to listen to you, Emily. I always learn from you.
Likewise.
Well, thank you, Gail and Emily, for your enriching presentation today. And I'm so sorry that I have to bring it to a close, but we could go on with the insights and perspectives that you give. So thank you so much. And I'd like to also give a special thanks to our Connor Institute Constitution Series sponsors, Bank of America, MUFG Nan Mahathi, and SRP. And to you, we hope that you will join us for our next Constitution on September 24th, when our guest will be Judge Douglas Ginsburg from Washington, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and author of Voices of Our Republic, and A More or Less Perfect Union. For more information, visit o'connorinstitute.org. Thank you again for being with us, and thank you again, Gail and Emily, for such an incredible presentation today.
Oh, thank you. It was our honor to be with you.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a good, wonderful day.